So this is part 3 of what is liberation. So this is the question that I'm kind of posing here, because it may not be so obvious to many of us. Like when we're talking about liberation, we might have a lot of different ideas about what that means. What does it mean to be free? And even within Buddhism, this idea has changed. So coming back to this kind of overall big look of where we are here, liberation meant something for early Buddhism, as Buddhism evolves, for later Buddhism. Buddhism means something in a Chinese and a Japanese context, and it means something in Zen. Liberation, though, we don't come totally without our own perspectives about what liberation is as well. And we've been informed by science, by Western religions, as well as colonialism. So that's kind of the big view. And where we are right now is going to look at this second arrow of how Buddhism has changed. So where we left off last time was looking at how Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, we tend to see these different isms as like three separate, completely distinct entities. But that's more of I would suggest that's a kind of a Western lens through which we look at religion. Like, this is Hinduism, and if you're a Hindu, you can't be a Buddhist or you can't be a Jain. I was really glad about a year or so ago, I invited somebody who might be considered from a Western perspective as a Hindu. He's actually a professor at Iowa State. I'm not sure if he's still working there now, but I haven't heard from him in a while. But he would be considered himself a Hindu. And he came to talk about Hinduism to my world religions class. And I was delighted that he brought 2 students, one of whom was Jain. And in the Jain's eyes and in the Hindu's eyes, there was no real separation between the two. They didn't see themselves as so strikingly different as perhaps we would see a Christian and a Jew or a Muslim. So this particular analogy or this particular way of looking, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism is not the same as we would see, for example, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or even within Christianity, Protestantism, Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodox. I don't think they see themselves as that distinctly separate. It's probably more along these lines, whereas Hinduism is considered kind of the base, the foundation, and the other 2 religions have largely drawn from Hinduism, and they're very much related. And this informs us when we think about the question of karma, of action. Karma meaning selfless service, because that's the way. This is the second perspective on how do we attain liberation. Liberation isn't just like a philosophical idea. It's not just simply knowing that Atman is Brahman, but how do we live our lives towards selfless service? That's also another way of understanding what liberation is. If you want to know what liberation is, it means completely fulfilling your duty, your job. So we're still here looking at Indian, and particularly early Indian, maybe perhaps Hindu ways of thinking about liberation. In the Bhagavad Gita, it talks about what is liberation. Another word is salvation. So we can get confused by the different terminology. But I'm seeing liberation as synonymous here with salvation. And the Gita says there are 2 paths of salvation open to the people of this world. The path of knowledge is for people of wisdom, and the path of work is for people of action. Perfection cannot be reached either through inaction or renunciation of work. So in other words, if we think that liberation is going to come by becoming a monk, and then if I could only be a monk and wear the Buddha's robes, then I will get there. But I'm not there yet. This particular passage doesn't allow that. The Gita is really clear that it's impossible to not act. It's impossible to renounce work, because every breath we take, as long as we're alive, we're doing some kind of activity. So activity is ongoing. It's not something that we can stop. And that's a place where I think a lot of us get confused. We think meditation is a kind of stopping. And in a sense it is. We are stopping our usual activities, but it doesn't mean we stop activity. We're still very much doing, we're still very much alive. So what does it mean to meditate? What does it mean to stop doing, or to do non-doing, or to renounce work? Especially if it's impossible to completely be inactive, right? And meditation itself is very active, or at least it has that potential to be. So there was two perspectives. One is through knowing, and that's kind of what we talked about the last time. We talked about this idea of understanding Atman as Brahman on a very profound level. And then the second one being activity or action, or karma yoga, which means selfless service. And selfless service has to do with doing your duty, whatever it might be. And in ancient times, the doing of our duties may have been much clearer than what it is today, because you were born into a particular caste, and that was your job, that was your duty. So to fulfill it completely, that's the way liberation could be attained. So if you're a warrior like Arjuna, then to fight was your job, and that was your way to liberation. For us, it might be some other activity. So whatever it is that your job is, to execute it completely. But there's a third perspective here and these three perspectives are not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to choose one of them. They're kind of all intertwined. They all inform each other. They can guide us. So it's not like you have to choose one or the other. But here's a third perspective on liberation. It has to do with devotion, or what's called bhakti. So bhakti, in the Bhagavad Gita, it says here, good people worship me, Arjuna, for 4 basic reasons: to be relieved of suffering, to understand life, to rise from poverty to wealth, and just because they are already wise. Just because they are wise already. So devotion has to do with serving God, however you might understand that word God, or serving spirit. That's the means to liberation. It might mean, and here you see this image of Krishna and his lover. And that's also a kind of a devotion. So it could be devotion to the God that is within the person that you love, right? That's also a kind of devotion. So these are 3 kind of ideas that have been floating around the Indian subcontinent for probably hundreds of years at least, about how do you get there. Now, until about, I want to say around 2,000 years ago, the idea that you could break the cycle of samsara was limited to largely to the Brahmin caste and to those who left the world. And what's happened here is the Bhagavad Gita and other stories begin to open this up. And it allows people who do not necessarily have the causes and conditions to be monks, to leave the world, to be Brahmins. They don't have those conditions. It allows them an entranceway into liberation from the cycle of samsara. So you can enter, or you could break out of the cycle of suffering through selfless service, through doing your job completely. And who doesn't have a job? Everybody has a job. Or you could do that through the practice of devotion, devoting yourself to God in some form, making offerings, making sacrifices to a particular God. And that could be in a very formal way where an altar is set up to a particular God, or it could be in a less formal way where you see the people that you work for as God and you're devoting yourself 100% to them. Early Buddhism has some similar ideas and perspectives as Hinduism. And the Buddha looks at this idea of liberation from a monk's perspective. And this is kind of hard, I think, for a lot of, if you're not a monk, if you haven't left home, if you haven't renounced the world, it may be very hard for the majority of people in the Buddha's time to attain liberation. So his message, his early message, was geared towards monks, but those monks, they had to also teach to lay people. So there's a very kind of clear separation and distinction between a monk and a lay person, a monk or a nun and a lay person. There's a clear separation between them. And actually, the Buddha also attempted to include non-home or lay people through teaching. So he didn't emphasize that lay people meditate. That was for the monks and the nuns to do. But the monks and the nuns, their job, their duty was to teach the Dharma to the lay people. And the lay people, they could attain some understanding, some insight through listening to the Dharma. And so that's, so this is another way that the teaching of liberation widens to a bigger population than just monks or nuns. But we have to be, there may have been some, at some point, especially as early Buddhism develops, there's some ideas that it became very closed-minded, and that liberation, especially after the death of the Buddha, became the preoccupation of the priests, of the monks and the nuns, that was almost reserved exclusively for them, so that you had to become one in order to attain liberation. So this is kind of how early Buddhism begins to develop. And then out of that kind of closed-mindedness comes Mahayana Buddhism, or the great vehicle. The great vehicle is not just for certain exclusive monks or nuns, but it's for everybody. Everybody can attain liberation. But before we get there, let's look at, well, what did the Buddha teach? Because this is stuff that we can gain understanding from. And one of his early teachings, the main thing he taught was these, what's called the 3 marks of existence: anicca, dukkha, anatman. Release from the cycle of suffering in the Buddhist terminology is called nirvana. So what are these things? Anicca means all things being impermanent. There's no changeless reality. And this is a verse from the Dhammapada. So the Dhammapada, these are said to be the direct words of the Buddha. He says, he didn't write this because these were probably memorized the first couple of centuries after the Buddha's death. When a person considers this world as a bubble of froth and as the illusion of appearance, then the king of death has no power over him or her. So considering ourselves like froth, right? That's our lifespan, like froth. And so liberation in that context has to do with perhaps knowing the swiftness of life and feeling that sense of impermanence, not thinking we're going to be around forever. And this might be in contrast to the idea of an Atman, where it was just assumed that we continue from lifespan to lifespan to lifespan to lifespan, and we're going to be around. We have lots of opportunities to continue to break free of the cycle. But with impermanence, there's a kind of different emphasis. It's moving towards, hey, look at this. We're not guaranteed even this out-breath. Pay attention to your life. You can't wait until the next lifetime. Buddha didn't deny countless life cycles, but he was more fixed. He was wanting us, I think, to look at how short our lifespan is and to appreciate everything fully in noticing the shortness of life. So continuing this first noble truth that the Buddha taught is that we cannot escape suffering. And liberation comes through acceptance of that. So the first noble truth of suffering is the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. The Buddha teaches that there is suffering, right? And this is not different from what the Hindu teaching is talking about, that we're in cyclic existence and there's a way to get out. There's freedom from it. There's liberation from it. And the Buddha just says, this is a noble truth. So quit trying to run away from it. There may have been in the Buddha's time, everybody's trying to get out of suffering, and they were not seeing, well, part of the liberation of suffering comes through acceptance of that suffering. We can't ignore or try to break free of suffering without acknowledging it. It seems like a obvious point, but when we really look more closely at how we live, we can see that we're biologically programmed to move away from suffering. Just as if I were to put my hand on a hot stove, I would immediately, accidentally put it on a hot stove. Biologically, all my instincts are telling me, move away. It wouldn't say, keep your hand on the stove. And in a bigger way, when we are confronted with suffering, there's something about self-preservation that takes over instinctually. And so our practice is about noticing that tendency to draw away from pain and to really kind of return, be willing to watch our reaction. The second major teaching is that of no self. So these are what I'm going to share here is also called the three marks of existence. Suffering, that there is suffering, is the first one. That there is no self is the second one. Okay, so anatman. And Buddha doesn't see this. When the Buddha looks for this atman, this true self, he doesn't see it. So where is it? And the way he describes the self, instead of thinking of the atman as equal to Brahman, what he says is the self is comprised of what's called 5 skandhas or 5 heaps. Right? The 5 heaps are form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. If you want to know what a self is, it's comprised of those 5 things. And when those 5 things are together, you have a self. And as soon as any one of those 5 disappears, there's no longer a self there. All right. So this is kind of a summary of this kind of difference between early Buddhism and early Hinduism. All right, so as far as liberation goes, if we look on the left side, karma yoga, which is selfless service. There's bhakti, which is devotion. There is this idea, this idea that's also kind of the liberation through wisdom. Atman is Brahman. The Yoga Sutras also very connected with Buddhism. And it says, yogas chitta vritti nirodha, restraint of the modifications of the mind is itself yoga. So how do you attain liberation? Is through restraining the mind. This is a lot, and this is like a lot to kind of take in at once. Just kind of bear with me here. In Buddhism, we have kind of parallel to karma yoga, selfless service. The Buddha introduces this idea of the Eightfold Path, that there is, what's part of that is right livelihood. And so the job that you do, and also preceding right livelihood, is right action. So if you want to attain nirvana, then considering right action and right livelihood is of paramount importance. And the Buddha didn't think that you had to stay stuck necessarily in your caste system and had to do those particular duties. In fact, he said that, you know, doing a job that is non-harming is important. So, for example, not taking care of livestock was considered right livelihood. Not doing a job that is dealing with livestock. I can't remember now if that was for monks or for everyone, but that was part of it. So, but in either case, ahimsa is a central part of the path. So number 2 here, devotion to God or bhakti. The Buddha had never taught any of his disciples to see him as a guru, or to devote themselves to him as if they were devoting themselves to a god. Rather to devote themselves to his teachings, to the Dharma. And upon his death, he says, be a light unto yourself. So this is kind of a difference between Hinduism and Buddhism. But I would also add that this idea of devotion comes into Buddhism later. It kind of comes back into Buddhism as Buddhism evolves. And there is this movement towards seeing the Buddha as a god, or as God. And that might come as a shock for some people, because I think, particularly in Western practice centers, there's this kind of emphasis that the Buddha was not a god. And it's true that he taught that, and we can see him as a human being that lived at a certain time. But if we really look at Mahayana Buddhism and how it's changed and evolved, there absolutely definitely is this transition from seeing Buddha as a human being to seeing Buddha as God. And the word for, there's what's called the Trikaya, the 3 bodies of the Buddha. The Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and the Dharmakaya. The Nirmanakaya is that historical Buddha. Sambhogakaya is the bliss body of the Buddha. This is the Buddha that's not bound by space and time. This is this kind of universal absolute Buddha. Maybe something similar to the concept of Brahman. And then the Dharmakaya, which are the teachings of reality as it is. That in itself is Buddha. So one of the epithets for the Buddha, for example, was the thus come one, the one that comes from thusness. He who sees Dharma sees me. That's one of the teachings of the Buddha. And that Dharma is itself Buddha. Okay, looking at this third line here, on the left side, you have the idea from the Upanishads that, you know, gaining wisdom, gaining knowledge about the nature of reality. Atman is Brahman, and you have like a strong emphasis on the practice of meditation, and for Buddhism as well, there is a strong emphasis on the practice of meditation, although it's not on the idea that necessarily that there is an Atman, but Buddha deconstructs the idea of a self, of a fixed self that transmigrates from one lifetime to the other. And then the third thing, or the second part of the third thing, is also this Yoga Sutras, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, restraining the mind. This is also the practice of meditation. And it's certainly present in the teachings of the Buddha, in the Dharma. So I would just say, like, kind of as a summary, these are ways that liberation has been conceived of in Indian culture. These are some of the ways. There may be other ways as well, but these are ones that I find I keep coming across. This is what if we want to know what does liberation look like, well, it's not just one thing. There's a lot of things. It has to do with practicing meditation, but also has to do with how you live your life, the job that you do. It has to do with your devotion to your love, really, devotion or love for that which is greater than yourself. And also being able to see through the illusory nature of things, to see that life is impermanent, right? In a very subtle way. So as Buddhism evolves over the next 500 years, there's a shift in the way of seeing, and this idea of emptiness is not unique, is something new that begins to appear as Buddhism changes the idea of emptiness. Right? The Buddha didn't teach about emptiness. He taught about the non-selfless nature of the self, that there is no self. But later, as Buddhism evolves, now you have the teaching of emptiness, that the five skandhas, the five heaps of form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, these five things are themselves empty as well. So the Buddha didn't talk about that, but later Buddhists do, particularly Nagarjuna talks about the emptiness of these five skandhas. Some ways of kind of, getting out of our head about this. One of the things that the Buddha taught is that things are not as they appear, nor are they otherwise. So we begin to get into the paradoxical nature of reality. And emptiness is one way, teachings on emptiness is one way to get or enter into paradox. Early Buddhist teaching are almost very logical, step by step. Do these 8 steps of the Four Noble of the Eightfold Path, one by one, and you'll attain nirvana. But later, as Buddhism evolves, you have a shifting into the paradoxical nature of reality. So here's another statement. There is Buddha for those who do not know what Buddha is, really. There is no Buddha for those who do know what Buddha is, really. So how do we get our minds wrapped around this paradox? And the other thing that is really a shift, and it highlights Buddhism as a unique kind of tradition, is that Buddhism negates itself as well as the Buddha. The Buddha becomes negated as Buddhism matures. And this is kind of like saying that it would be the parallel to Christians negating Jesus. I think if you told people this, particularly from a Christian perspective, it would be perhaps seen as like blasphemy or something. But from a Buddhist perspective, the way that we grow in wisdom is through negating the Buddha. And this doesn't mean that we're disrespectful, but it's for the Buddha to enter into us. We have to, in the Zen koan talks about if you want to meet the Buddha, if you want to meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. So these are some statements from the fundamental wisdom of the middle way, talking about the 5 skandhas, those form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. When form and content, so content being the non-physical side of reality, are separate, even form itself cannot manifest. It is not that content manifests itself because of form. Instead, form and content are always a fusion. So Nagarjuna is kind of he's a philosopher. Whoops. Nagarjuna is a philosopher, and he takes us even deeper and closer into this idea of form. And we start to see the dissolving of form here. In relying upon the thought of form and content, although they are seen as separate, form and content may be only the 2 fused into 1. When something is illogical, it can never exist in this world. And both that illogical something and content might be different from what really exists in this world. So, this is really hard stuff to get our minds wrapped around. How do we make sense of what Nagarjuna is saying here? But I just present it as a way of showing how later teachers within the Buddhist tradition start to consider the early Buddhist teachings. And there's one way to look at how Buddhism develops is that there are what's called the 3 turnings of the wheel of the Dharma. So the early Buddhist teachings, the first 500 years or so, is considered the first turning of the wheel. These are the original teachings of the Buddha. The emphasis is on no self, impermanence, the 4 noble truths. It's individually oriented. So a person is purifying themselves through morality and analyzing their personal experience. It's a personal liberation. All right. The second turning of the wheel, or another way to talk about it, is middle way Buddhism. And there's a shift to what's called the cosmic Buddha. So in the first turning, the Buddha is a human being. The second turning, the Buddha is lifted up to this cosmic being. And what happens is the 4 noble truths are negated. The 5 skandhas are negated. There's not as much an emphasis on no self and impermanence, but rather the emphasis is on there being no independent existence. Okay, and then there's the third turning of the wheel, which is Mahayana Buddhism, which we'll look at next time.